Hello and welcome back to awtoolbox.com. My name's Glenn Keller, and in this video we are diving a little deeper into utilizing structures inside of Active Workspace. So the version of Teamcenter we're in is 24.12, and we have the Active Workspace client up and running with an assembly provided by Sherpa Designs up and loaded in the display. So what we're going to do here is go in and learn a little bit about how you can interact with an assembly, learn a little bit about permissions, and go ahead and duplicate an assembly, revise an assembly, or save as an assembly to see what kind of effects we can do to kind of create a derivative assembly. In the previous video, we walked through kind of expansions, interacting with the views, looking at columns, all the different buttons that are available in here, and just kind of gave an overview of that. In this one, we're going to use some additional buttons in that set and take them through to show you what they do. So to begin with, I have this cutting head assembly. It has a lot of subcomponents on it. It's not the biggest assembly in the world, but it is definitely a fair size. And what I'm going to do in here is you'll notice that I don't have the ability to come in here and edit the structure, nor do I have the ability to add anything to it. So in my case, my use case is I need to create a derivative of this assembly so that I have access rights to make modifications to it. Now in here, there are a couple of different ways you can do that. So it all depends on the use case. So the first thing I could do is I could take the top level assembly and I could come in and do what's called a save as. Now a save as function can be performed on pretty much anything as long as you have the permissions to do so. But what it does is it takes the existing component that you have selected and then attaches any additional parts or files based on a set of rules and then assigns it a new ID, but you don't really get the ability to tweak that ID, what the next counter option is going to be, and you don't really get to decide on what happens to the child objects in that assembly. So if I do a save as, which you can see in this menu option up here, and then I can give it a name, and you'll see that the new ID of the assembly is 132, or the old ID is 132, which is the ID of that assembly, and it's going to give me a new ID in sequence. So I'm going to call this one my ASSY X through Y cutting head, and I'll spell it lowercase so I can tell right away, and I'll do just in parentheses save as, or I'll put that in the description, save as method, just so that we can tell. In the advanced copy options, you can see I can dictate if the JT file comes across or if the related CAD geometry comes across. In this case, it's not going to include the rendering relationship. If I scroll to the right of that, notice it removes it, and I could say I want to include, reference it, save as, basically create a new iteration of it. So if I want to save as, that means I'm probably going to change the design of the component. If I do a reference, then I'm just referencing back to the original design. So in this case, I'm going to save as. And then you'll see you get some additional options here. So in the save as, you get the revision, the tool, all those components, and then the names you can fill out, but notice the IDs are not editable. So I'm going to choose save at this point, and it's going to go through and save as that cutting head assembly and open up the new one. So now it's opening up the 00029 assembly, which is a completely different, it's the next open ID in the counter. And you can see I do own this top level object. If I select it and scroll down, I am the admin 01 at the moment. So I can see that I own that object. Now, if I select one of the subcomponents here, notice that I do not own that object, so somebody else does. So all that did was created a copy of this with a new ID, gives me permissions, so I can come in here and if I could add something to it, like maybe say add child now. So I could edit it, but I still wouldn't be able to edit these bottom level assemblies. So if I say add, I could do a sibling because that edits the top level assembly, but it doesn't allow me to add child objects to the subassembly. So if the goal was to create a new parent assembly, inherit much of the previous assembly, not change those components at all, and then maybe modify the top level component of this new assembly, then save as will work for you. Now, if you wanted to take that a step further, let's go ahead and go back. Another option that you have is called revise. So if I select this top level component, this is the one I don't own. So if I wanted to create a new revision of this, you can see it's revision A. Maybe I sent that through a workflow and it got into an obsolete or a hold state or something like that. It wasn't approved. And the reason it wasn't approved is something to do with the attachments or something to do with a wrong cage code or a wrong attribute value, something along those lines. So in the workflow, I could have modified it and just fixed it and kept going if my business rules were that. But in a lot of companies, they want to basically obsolete this revision and then create a new revision so that you have a little accountability on what has changed over time. Now, a revise isn't like a save as. So a revise is more designed around tweaking the existing part. We're not changing its form, fit, or function. And that's kind of the goal. So just attribute changes, little small tunes or tweaks. Save as is like if you're creating a completely new part with the bones of the part that you have now. So you intend it to do something else, but you like this as a starting point. So if you're going to revise though, I'm going to come in here. Theoretically, you would want to release this one first, and then I'm going to come in and say new revise. So I'm going to say revise this, and then I get the next revision letter in sequence, and your company may be different. You may have B01 or B02. You may start with a dash letter and then go to O1. Whatever be the case, your administrators will have designed that for you. You provided a name. You can modify that if you wish. I'm going to put in the description, just kind of revise structure, just so I know this one was the one that was revised. And then I also get those advanced copy options. So again, this only dictates the attachments of that object. Now this view down here, this is the assembly. So this BOM view revision, that's the assembly itself. And notice this one has no action. So I could tell it to revise the assembly or bring it through, but in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and click revise. And you'll notice I don't have the permission to revise that object, because in this case, I'm not creating an entirely new object. All I'm doing is going through and creating a new iteration of an existing object. So my permissions are a little different in this case. However, if I were to open up the new assembly that we created, I'm going to go to my Explorer. I'm going to go into my Home folder and then my New Stuff folder. And you'll see that new assembly that I created that opened up automatically got dropped in here to give me a quick reference to it. Anything that you create in the system, if you haven't defined a place for it to go during the creation process, is going to get a shortcut to this location. Now, since I own this top level assembly, I can come back in here and I can choose new, revise on it, give it the B, add the description. We'll modify this and we'll say revise method. We could do the advanced copy options. In this case, I do want to go ahead and change this. I want to basically reference the latest version of that direct model data set, and then it should bring down the assembly as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I could check and say open new revision, or I just want to revise it and keep going. So in this case, I got a internal error for the revise. So again, depending on your permissions in the system, you may be able to or may not be able to do that. In here, I'm going to switch that back to remove and hit revise, and you'll notice now I can do it. So that revise and relate to latest component didn't quite work in my environment, but it may in yours. So in this case, you can see it opens up. You can see it is Rev B now. So Rev B could be different than Rev A. And we have now created a new assembly but the components are still referencing the old components owned by the other user. Okay, so we have now talked about save as, which creates a whole new component. You don't need additional permissions to do that because you're not really manipulating that top level object. We've talked about revise, which is kind of a smaller change to an existing object, but you do need permissions because you are changing that object. And then the other one is duplicate, and this is the one that's going to give you the ability to reference, to not reference, to change IDs, to dictate how the entire structure is duplicated. So far we've only ever been able to control this top level object and things directly attached to it. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, let's duplicate this assembly. So you can see right above the component, we have duplicate here, and I'm going to go ahead and say duplicate. So in this case, it'll open up in a full screen, and you can see I have expansion rules where I could expand everything below or collapse. But in this case, I'm building a completely new cutting head assembly, and I intend to add some additional components to it. So what I'm going to do here is, this is the cutting head assembly, but I'm going to change the name of it. Now it's just going to be cutting head alternate. So in there, I'm going to change the description, and you can see that when I clicked off the other one, it's kind of marking up my previous value with a red line and then my new value with green. In this case, it's going to be updated cutting head assembly. And then obviously I'm just going to leave the quantity off and then move off of that. So in here you can see the ID says that it's going to replace the 0029. If I right click on this line, notice I have some additional options, but if I left click in the field, notice it doesn't let me do anything to dictate this ID. So we'll take a look at that as we go forward a little bit more. Now, if I right click on the object below it, now you'll see that I have the ability to replace this object with another object. I could remove this object altogether. Maybe I'm designing a new channel. I could save as this object during the duplication process, which is kind of what I want to do. I could also clone this object. And so basically it's going to get new IDs and it's going to duplicate its structure. So if I save as, I get the new top level assembly that I can change, but if I clone, I get the entire sub-assembly. So that's what I'm going to do. So you can see it's recording the actions I'm choosing here, where I've got cloning this assembly, and then if I expand it, you'll see all of the subcomponents get a clone that they're going to get a new ID. And then I could modify their attributes as I go. So I've updated that assembly as well as the first child assembly here. I'm also going to remove this bearing. So in this case, maybe the goal is to replace it with a new alloy or something along those lines. I'm going to go ahead and right click and choose remove. And now I've removed that component completely. And then maybe I want to add a new component to the list or replace a component. So if I right click again, notice that save as, clone, etc., add isn't here. So I have to wait until I've completed the duplication process to be able to add new components. But if I wanted to replace this hex socket head, I could hit replace, and then I get access to my search. So I could say socket, and depending on what I find, maybe I want to replace it with this one. Hit replace, and then you'll see that if I expand the item ID column here, you can see the old one with the new one and what it's going to do. So you can keep going down and check each one of these. You do have quick hits across the top, and then once you're done, just take a quick look at these settings over to the right hand side. And you can say, I want default IDs generated for these new IDs, or you could come in and you could say ID naming rule. And then in the prefix, you could say add a prefix to that naming rule. So I could say new underscore, for instance. And what it'll do is end up appending new underscore to the beginning of each of these IDs. I could also replace 00 with 11, or by using these two fields down below. I'm going to use default IDs for now and just kind of close this, but just kind of reference that. And then notice this run in background up here. This is going to run with what's called the async service, which means it'll do it kind of in the background, out of sight, out of mind if you have async turned on. Now, in our case, we're going to uncheck it just so you can see the process run. And then in future videos, we'll have it checked with async running so that you get a little notification when it's completed up here. If you're performing this task against very large assemblies, it could take a while, and you don't want to lock up your screen during that process, and that's kind of what the run in background is for. I'm going to go ahead and click duplicate at this point, and you'll see that the window, there'll be a bar that kind of goes across at the top there, indicating that it's loading, and because this isn't the largest assembly in the world, it achieved its goal fairly quickly. So it'll tell you that it built it. It did put a link to this assembly into my new stuff folder at that point. And then you'll notice that this first assembly down has a new ID set, but it's also, in this case, if I come down a little bit further, notice that each component inside of here, depending on who you created it as, new owners, those types of things, may have new attributes against them. Like new owning user, etc. So it just depends on how you did it. In this case, I've got my top level object, and at that point I could come in and choose add a child, and then I could do a search, and I'm going to add my bearing back in, and it's this one. Hit add. And notice I had some options to add quantity or quantity per occurrence, but I added that back in. So now I can do things like splitting screens and comparing different assemblies, because now I have multiple assemblies. I can also begin to edit the assembly and play around with markup mode or other options. Feel free to take a look at our next video, which will dive into kind of pulling up two assemblies, doing a comparison between them. We'll go find the assemblies that we just built, open them up, and just kind of interact between them. We'll do various things like open in round trip Excel, and we'll play around with the additional options that we haven't looked at yet.